Good afternoon, everyone. Great to have you with us. It's about 12:30, and we will give everyone about a minute to get logged in. We're so glad that you could join us. I invite you to jump into the chat and introduce yourself and tell us where you work, and we'll get started momentarily. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Cullen. I'm a program manager at the Children's Cabinet, and welcome to our second webinar in our summer series. If you haven't heard about the Children's Cabinet, we are a nonprofit that has been in Nevada since 1985. Our mission is to keep children safe and families together. One of our programs is supporting businesses throughout the state to examine their family-friendly policies and benefits to help support working parents. We are excited to have business professionals like yourself join us in our deep dive into the effects the lack of childcare have on our economy. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. We are recording this webinar, so please stay on mute during the presentation. You can use the chat function to ask questions, and we will answer at the end if there's time. As you know, quality childcare is not only important to our children and families and the development of our future workforce, but it is critical to the workforce today. It is essential to today's economy because it allows millions of working parents the ability to go into work, for businesses to make money, and the national and state economies to grow. Our summer series Lunch and Learn webinars are meant to build upon each other. Our first webinar in the series was Understanding the Current Childcare Landscape in Nevada. If you missed that webinar, you can view it at childrenscabinet.org/businesses, and we will put that in the chat for you. Today, our expert will be diving into the economic effects the lack of childcare causes. We are joined by Joseph Fuller, who is a professor of management practice at the Harvard Business School, the co-director of the school's long-term project, Managing the Future of Work, and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institution. He studies issues related to demographics, employment, and income polarization. His research on the workings of the care economy in the United States focuses on the impact that episodic and predictable caregiving obligations have on workers, their career paths, and the implications for employers. His current research focuses on how employer practices unintentionally marginalize various groups of workers, including caregivers, and how emerging employment models, like the gig economy, are creating new outlets for workers historically unable to meet traditional criteria imposed on full-time workers by employers. He has also done pioneering research on the economics of caregiving benefits and the returns that accrue to employers by providing benefits that support caregivers. And I'll pop the link to his full work in the chat. Professor Fuller, welcome.
Well, thank you, Kim, for that warm welcome, and I'm delighted to be here, and I'm also delighted that you're hosting this series and really trying to broaden people's understandings of the broad-based implications of caregiving for our economy and for our national competitiveness. The U.S. has not historically had a very effective care infrastructure, and that's really got some consequences for our capacity to grow in the future and to remain a competitive economy. So I'm going to share some data with you. This data is all drawn from materials that are available to people off the website that Kim shared, but I'll also make sure that Kim has a copy if people want to look at specific slides once we're done. So I'm going to share my screen now. Let's start with some really quick basics about the demography of the workforce in the United States. Workforce participation has really stagnated in the U.S. after about 2003, 2004. And prior to that, it was very lackluster through except for the admission of women more broadly into the workforce. So throughout the post-war period, male workforce participation was basically declining slightly, particularly starting in the 80s, but the cavalry, if you will, that kept our workforce growing was female. And it's important for people to remember a couple of quick things about growth in the United States. Growth in any economy is really a function of two things. One is how fast your productivity is growing, and the second is how fast your workforce is growing. So as our workforce has started to taper off in terms of its growth, you see nominal GDP growth rates, i.e. the rate the economy is growing, which shows up in all of your revenues, beginning to get slower. And this is even more visible in Western Europe, where the workforce is flat or actively shrinking, where they have much less effective integration, and where they've lagged in productivity because the US has been more effective at adopting IT to drive productivity. So when we have a stagnant workforce, it's an economic burden, not just a hiring burden. We also, of course, have to recognize that our population is getting older, and as a function of that, what's called the dependency ratio gets worse, i.e. how many people who are not in the workforce, kids or seniors, depend on what ratio of workers to pay for their educations, for their Social Security and whatnot. Historically, those numbers were close to double of where they're headed today. So it's really urgent that we get as many people participating in the workforce to support this aging population, but also to allow the economy to grow. There's another key consideration when we start thinking about care, though, which is educational attainment. On this slide, you can see women's share of postgraduate degrees, both PhD degrees in the gold and master's degrees in the blue. Women are currently an absolute majority of both categories, PhD candidates and master's candidates, and they're also 58% of current college enrollees. So when we think about the future of work and what it's going to require, particularly in terms of technical literacy, numeracy, and whatnot, that's often correlated with a post-secondary degree, a college degree or beyond. And higher ed in the US in terms of participation and degree attainment is getting more and more female. By the way, that's true across the globe as well. So if you look at Germany, an absolute majority of PhD and master's candidates in Germany are women, just like the United States, but it's the same in India and it's the same in China. So this is more than just a US phenomenon. But it's particularly important when we start thinking about the nature of work in the future. This is work done by my colleague David Deming at Harvard, one of my co-heads of the other project I run at Harvard. And what we looked at was how the attributes of jobs had changed over time. And he looked at them in two dimensions: social skills and numeracy. What's a social skill? It's not being the life of the party. It's not being the most fun at the 19th hole of the golf course. It's the capacity to interact effectively with other human beings, to go into unfamiliar territory, unfamiliar groups and be productive, good communication skills, the ability to engage a range of people comfortably and quickly. And as you can see here, David charted in a very fundamental piece of work how jobs had grown in terms of a combination of social skills and numeracy. And as you can see, the growing skills in the blue and red line, the growing percentage of the workforce and also earnings potential in the workforce are correlated first and foremost with social skills. So yes, the winning hand is high social skills, that ability to engage all sorts of people, but also being numerate and technically literate. But the second rapidly growing part of the workforce is high social skills without those mathematical skills. And low social skills jobs, particularly low social skills, low technological quotient in the yellow, that have been really dropping off. These trend lines end in about 2015 in David's analysis, but they continue on today. Now, I just said earlier that higher degree attainment, which is going to be more and more female, is positively correlated with high math and high technological aptitude. But let's also look at data about social skills. This is work done by the Pew Center, but it supports some existing research I haven't published yet, which shows that women who are the light green color exceed the performance level of men in the gold on social skills, as well as things like critical thinking and writing and analytical skills. And that has accounted in the last 30 to 40 years for a growing convergence of the earnings power of men and women, which you see on the right-hand side of the chart. So women have a distinct advantage in multiple dimensions of the types of skills that are most relevant to the future: social skills, critical thinking, analytical skills. So as an employer, you have to ask yourself a question. If I'm going to need people with high social skills in the future, combined with high analytical skills, where am I going to look? And you're going to increasingly look at higher ed, and you'll increasingly look at women candidates. Therefore, we have to ask ourselves, are we configured as employers to support both hiring women and then sustaining their career paths? And that's really the bulk of my research that I'm going to share with you today. So first of all, when we're talking about women, we're talking about people who are disproportionately charged with caring for children, which is, of course, your interest in joining this webinar today. So women are primarily in charge of taking care of children 60% of the time. They tend to be women still in childbearing years, but after household formation, 30 to 40%, ages 30 to 40, almost half have that post-congressional degree, and a lot are managerial or professional. We have more household formation and higher fertility now in people who are in management white-collar roles as a percentage of the overall population as ever before. And when we're talking about caregiving, we are talking about taking care of kids. So this just shows from my research, when you're giving care to someone, who are we talking about? We talk about newborns, we're talking about kids, or we're talking about family members, spouses, parents. Now, about 50 million American adults are taking care of kids and their parents at the same time, the so-called senior generation. But you can see from this data, when you're talking about caregiving responsibility, first and foremost, you're talking about having a newborn, taking care of a child who has an illness, could be temporary, could be a permanent condition, could be a high needs kid, special needs kid. And it's also just the day-to-day of taking care of kids, getting them to school, making sure they're safe after school, getting them in activities, making sure they're living some type of rounded development. You get all the way down to fourth place before you get worried about taking care of seniors. Now, we have to acknowledge that when we talk about this need to take care of kids, that childcare in the United States is very, very expensive. Here just shows you from my colleague Mark Perry at AEI what types of services and businesses have been exceeding inflation in terms of their cost versus those that have diminished. So brown goods like TVs have never been cheaper, all the way at the bottom, but you can see childcare and nursery school has continued to grow at well above the rate of inflation. And some research I'm currently doing, not published yet, the typical couple thinks that childcare will cost them on the order of 7% of their household income before they have the child. The actual number is in the low 20s for a typical household. So childcare is a major determinant of how caregiving gets delivered, and the capacity of these women workers who are disproportionately responsible for childcare and will, in my estimation, become more and more important in the workforce of the future, given the skills requirements, than they have been historically. So the absence of a U.S. childcare system is going to put a big anchor on the ability of those women who are disproportionately responsible for childcare to either stay in the workforce or stay on their current career paths. Now, we've done substantial research in this question, and we asked workers tell us to what degree caregiving has affected your ability to do your best at work. And here you can see the response. The 33% of the respondents, this is a valid sample of the US working population, said all of the time. Another 14% most of the time, and a remaining 36% some of the time. So over 80% say this is a distraction for me at some, most, or all of the time. We asked a companion question of employers. Please notice how this has worked. Does caregiving responsibility have no impact on employee performance at your organization? There are reasons that the question was structured this way that has to do with the architecture of the survey, but the answer is very important, and the discontinuity with the data on the left very profound, because only 24% of employers disagreed with the idea that caregiving had no impact on my business. So it's almost a mirror image of what employees say, because employees are saying this is a distraction for me, and almost half are saying a distraction for me a lot of the time or all of the time, whereas employers generally say, look, that just isn't a big deal for me. Only less than a quarter say it does have a substantial impact. I'm going to disagree with that statement. So let's unpack some of the data about the workers themselves. And let's take that all the time, most of the time, some of the time. And here's something I wish I could be with you live, of course, but here's something a lot of employers get wrong when you ask what their hypothesis is. In fact, they get it inverted from the reality. So here you can see the people who are most likely to be strongly affected by caregiving concerns while they're at work are senior leaders. So 53% of senior leaders who are in child caregiving or other caregiving modes said this is on my mind all the time, with a further 16% saying, yeah, most of the time. And then you can see it stair steps down to managers of managers, and frontline employees and lower paid employees. Many executives guess actually it's those frontline lower wage employees who'd be most affected. Their hypothesis is that those employees don't have money to throw at the problem, have inflexibilities in their work. But in fact, the senior leaders who are most concerned about this are the ones who are most likely to be affected. And the nature of that affect has costs on companies, which we're going to come to in a minute. Unsurprisingly, when you look at this through a demographic lens, you can see the responses of all employees by age on the right, but I want you to focus in on the senior leaders and executives on the right. And you can see that between the ages of 26 and 35, this becomes a very, very substantial set of issues. Unsurprising, because that's when households get formed and are the prime childbearing years, although it spills over a very high ratio into the 36 to 45-year-olds. So why do I want to point this out for you? For your highest paid employees, the ones that are most important, presumably, for your strategic execution and growth, why else are you paying them in the top quartile? And in the prime years in their career, where they develop the skills, the social networks, the knowledge of your organization in order to excel and really help your organization to prosper and grow, they are under considerable duress about caregiving. And caregiving is very, very much on their mind. And they don't have a lot of good options like affordable, high-quality childcare to fall back on, which is probably, in fact, inducing that very high level of concern that I'm pointing out to you. And this expresses itself in lots of different ways. This is surveys about how do caregivers, how does it affect their work? Things like I have to leave early, or I have to take a day off unexpectedly, or I'm going to decline a key project or business travel, and the quality of my work has suffered. You can see as you read down this list, I won't go through it in detail, but read this not just through the lens of what these workers are experiencing. Look at this list through the lens of your economics. We'll get to this toward the end of the presentation in some more detail. But particularly for a highly paid worker, this is for the entire sample, not just highly paid workers. I have to leave work early or unexpectedly, or I have to take a sudden day off. For someone who's got paid sick days or paid days off, this is directly related to your economics. Or someone who's declining to take on additional responsibilities or projects or business travel, if you asked them, you had an economic logic for trying to assign them that work. Or you're clearly dependent on the quality of their work, but yet 60% of your workers are saying caregiving concerns have an impact on the quality or the timeliness of my delivery of important work. So the notion that people are thinking and anxious about it, we all have all sorts of things, we can worry about, whether it's, whether our kids' team is going to win a tournament this weekend, or are they going to have a good time at camp, or, are their grades good enough? But it manifests itself in ways that impact your top line and your bottom line. And that gets shown in some other data as well. Caregivers also feel kind of under duress in the workplace. This just compares the 4 statements you can see in the gray, such as caregivers are perceived to be less committed to their careers than non-caregivers. And we asked employers in the gold color, do you agree with that statement? Do you think that's evident in your organization? And then in the blue, in the teal colored, we asked the workers. And you can see in each instance, there's a big difference in which, to the degree to which the workers believe these statements, that all of which suggest the working environment for caregivers in an organization isn't really supportive. And so if you've got a caregiver, an important person in your company, a well-paid worker that you're counting on, almost 60% of the time, they believe that making that caregiving obligation apparent or central to their conversation with their supervisor, with their peers, with the owner, with the operator, is actually will cause them to be perceived as less committed. Similarly, they're worried below that they won't get promoted as fast. They're worried over to the right that they will not be advanced as fast as non-caregiving peers. What does all of this mean? It means not only are caregivers under duress, that shows up in ways that affect your economics, but they don't want to raise it. They don't want to go to their manager or anybody other than a close friend in the company, and certainly not their boss's boss or the owner, to say, I've got a lot of caregiving, responsibilities. It kind of affects my ability to do the job sometimes. I hope that's okay. Because what they think they're doing is signaling lack of commitment, that it's going to affect their career progression, that others who aren't encumbered with these obligations will get to move faster. You can see this, I'm sure, for those of you who have hybrid workforces, where the hybrid workers are all expressing anxiety or concern or some resentment that people who are coming into the office all the time might get an edge on them by being present, because they might get a special project and get to spend time with someone who's going to influence their promotion face-to-face, when the hybrid worker is limited to preset meetings, usually with a lot of people involved. The consequence of this is it drives turnover. So go back to those 4 levels. Remember, the senior leaders were the most anxious about caregiving, manager of managers, and you can read the rest. Almost 50% of people in the top quartile of the workforce have left a job, and this is prior to COVID, have left a job because they could not reconcile the demands of work and their sense of what they had to do to quit their caregiving responsibilities. So sometimes when we talk about caregiving and we talk about benefits to support caregivers, kind of think about it in abstract. Just it'd be nice to help people, or make them feel under less pressure. But what does it cost you when a high potential, remember the age cohorts we're talking about here, a 30-something that's already in your top quartile of compensation, already a seat in leadership, of managing the manager of managers, somebody walks in and says, I've decided to resign. And remember, that's what's going to happen, because going in a year before and saying, I'm under a lot of pressure to give my caregiving with my kids, I'm not sure I can keep this up. They censor themselves from saying that because they're scared. What you're going to hear is, I'm not that committed to your job, and you really shouldn't count on me. And sure, probably don't want to give me the opportunity, so I'd be your favorite person for promotion because I've got these caregiving responsibilities. They attribute to you that you're really not interested in that, and that you're less likely to promote them or give them good opportunities if they admit it. So they tend to cover it up. And then you get the ugly surprise of a high potential person who will disproportionately be female, walking in and walking out the door. And you're a little bit of a loss to why, because they were doing great and you didn't understand what might be driving their behavior. As a quick aside, exit interviews, particularly for high accomplishing workers who are leaving, absolute must. You have to start gathering data on why people are leaving your organization. Even if it's not care, I assure you that you'll learn some important things that you can act upon. So, we asked, what are the biggest challenges in terms of balancing work and caregiving responsibilities? Here you can see emotional stress of handling both is the first choice 39% of the time, or 62% as first and second choice. You can see time responsibilities are second. Once again, I won't read through all this data with you, but you can see several things here that are interesting. One is there is a diverse set, but it really is disproportionately the psychological pressure and time between those two. You're already well into the 80s in terms of first and second variable. And when you add self-care, you're into the 90s. So it's really, I can't balance all this. I can't balance work and home responsibilities. I don't have time to do both. I'm the only person that's getting no time and attention is me. And I think for many of you who've seen reasonably significant increases in your mental health claims, that COVID had a very, very significant impact on driving these outcomes. That it heightened people's anxieties. I think it even heightened the anxieties of people who got some relief in terms of caregiving intruding on work and vice versa, because, for example, they were no longer commuting, to start worrying about what was life going to be after they went back to work normally. And that's feeding a bunch of the resistance you're seeing from some of your hybrid workers to come back to the office more. Now, this looks at actual benefits. And you can see 10 common benefits that relate in some ways to caregiving, not altogether. They can be indirect, like there's remote work available, or I can go from full-time to part-time. And you can see in the blue column, what's the frequency of those benefits being offered, and the red column not. So just to read this, 51% of employees report that their company offers flexible scheduling, and 43% say they don't. And you can see that the absolute availability of a lot of services that would support caregivers, like job sharing, like EAPs, like more remote work, are a minority, are only available to a minority of workers. Of course, this is a national sample, so that's got what we used to call essential workers, nurses, truck drivers, machine tool operators, croupiers who have to show up for work. There's no such thing as a virtual machine tool operator. Now let's contrast the with what percentage of the people in the workforce that have caregiving use the services offered. So 90% of the caregivers offered flexible scheduling use it. 88% of the workers offered remote or telework use it. And the amber column on the right is the percentage of workers who say, I would use it if it were available, averaged with the I am using it today. So you can see that a substantial portion of the workers not even offer these benefits would welcome having flexible scheduling, or would welcome having remote work or specialized caregiver services if it were available to them. So you can see here, there's a real appetite for trying to address some of the needs of caregivers, both indirectly, better mental health coverage, indirect work, effective EAP programs, not just programs that answer the phone and answer questions about what your health benefits cover, but also direct benefits like unpaid leave, a specialized caregiving services, a paid family medical leave. Now, I wanted to start building out the argument for you, the data, which I think is compelling, about these economic costs associated with outcomes driven by care, like voluntary turnover, like lost productivities. And I'm going to walk you through a case study now that's very recent that I completed only this spring. And in talking to caregivers in the sample, we were able to identify that 64%, when they got the care benefit we're going to talk about, missed fewer meetings or work days as a function of having the benefit. And 30% reported either not quitting or not asking for a leave of absence to deal with a caregiving issue. Remember, a lot of caregiving issues can be periodic and episodic. They're not infinite. Yes, if you have a special needs child, that is going to be for the duration. But if you have a kid that is an undiagnosed asthmatic, that may take 3 weeks off to get a good diagnosis and get a good regime, or a kid that's having trouble in school and concentrating, is this kid ADHD? What can we do about it? How do I work with a homeroom teacher, with a pediatrician to try to see if there's something more to be done about this? So the company that I studied was a company called Wellthy, WELLTHY. You can see it on the slide. For a care benefit company is trying to play on wellness. I know the management there. I think it's a very confusing name that everyone hears it as a pension management company or something like that. But what I want to demonstrate for you is the caregiving drives real costs like turnover and lost productivity. And we've already established that it's widespread. 73% of workers in the United States report they have 20 to 30 hours of caregiving work outside of work. And 86% of people that I call hidden workers report that caregiving was a major barrier to the employment. What do I mean by hidden workers? I have a long paper on this subject that you can access on my website, but I've identified that there's a population of about 25 million Americans who are effectively screened out of work by the way we do job searches. So most of you rely on an internal applicant tracking system as part of a let's say an Oracle installation. You hire using an ATS system where click on my website for an opportunity, or you're relying on someone like ZipRecruiter or Hired. And every single 99% of large companies and 90+% of all companies in the United States rely on someone that some service, internal or external, by the use or on a subscription basis, to hire, to attract candidates, winnow down the pool of applicants into highly qualified people to interview. Hidden workers are people who are disproportionately dropped from consideration in that process. They can be dropped for all sorts of different reasons, like what hours they can work, maybe they lack a college degree for a job that require ones, maybe they have a criminal record and you're not a second chance employer. But these 86% are a lot of those workers who are not participating in the workforce. And go back to some of the first things I mentioned to you, getting more workers to either go back into the workforce or stay in the workforce is a national priority. Because unless you think we're going to get a sensible immigration reform, in which case, be delighted to sell you my interest in the bridges that span the Charles River that runs next to our campus at Harvard. We're going to have to rely on keeping more of our workers in the workforce or getting people back into the workforce at a higher rate. So of a certain look, there's economics here, which I'm about to demonstrate to you in more detail, and there's a real need, but there's this problem, which is your benefits budgets are under severe pressure due to the mess, which is called self-insurance in the United States for healthcare. And you'll also, many of you will look at your current care benefits, say, hey, you know, these really aren't very well utilized. As a matter of fact, I'm kind of confused by what Fuller said, because we do have some care-oriented benefits, and you know, the benefits manager isn't coming in to say, well, these are really being used, maybe we should be adding more. My assertion to you, and I'm happy to answer questions about this later or by email, is most of the care giving benefits right now that are offered by companies have two attributes, which is they're cheap for you to offer, and that's because they don't really offer much value to the caregiver. We can say we offer unpaid compassionate leave, and I believe both of those words are important. Compassionate is something to be praised. Unpaid is not sustainable for a lot of people. We offer a program you can get extra vacation days in a family crisis, but we offer it by having you go around and ask your coworkers to donate their vacation days to you. That's a very awkward thing to ask. It's not, it's and you know, you only do that with your closest friends who are most intimately familiar with your caregiving obligations, a topic you discourage from talking about at work because you think it's going to penalize your career, per some things I said earlier. So the question is, how can we validate the ROI of providing better caregiving services? Because none of you are going to want to experiment with some expensive program hoping it pays off. You're going to want to have a demonstration proof that there's a good, hard-nosed business logic to it. And I've laid the groundwork for that by saying people are quitting jobs more often than I imagine you thought, and self-report them being less productive. What if we could change those things through implementing a benefit like Wealthy? What is Wealthy? Wealthy is a service that basically does, its big product line is they sell your company a program that provides what amounts to case management services when one of the lives covered has a complex medical issue come up. Could be for a kid, could be for a parent, could be for the worker themselves or their spouse. But you're sitting at home, you get the call from your mom. She says they've just come back from the doctor, gerontologist, who says, dad's got clear Alzheimer's symptoms and your mother's upset, doesn't know what to do. You start asking her questions. She doesn't seem to be giving you straight answers. You don't have the first idea what their insurance coverage is. You're not even that sure, you know, the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's and other conditions. What do you do next? You're often going to drop everything, go to your boss, or have a worker come to you and say, I got to go to Scottsdale, or I got to go to Juniper, Florida, or to wherever else to catch up with my parents because I don't know what's going on there, but it's really bad. And so Wealthy takes that on. So they're talking to the doctors. They understand what the insurance coverage is. They're big enough now so they kind of understand who the big cognitive care units are in Jupiter, Florida, or the cardiac care units in Scottsdale, Arizona. So let's look at what we did. I'm going to show you a couple of quick sensitivity analyses. And this is about turnover, and the second will be about productivity. On the vertical axis, you can see what kind of ROI do I command if I can reduce, if I buy wealthy at their nameplate price, if I can reduce turnover, which runs across the horizontal axis. So if you just look at this as a line, forget the other things which I'll talk about in a second, it would say that if I only reduce it 1%, I'm getting a negative return, the first blue dot. Then going to the right, okay, if I reduce my turnover by 3%, it looks like I'm in the money because that's a pretty big scaling effect on the y-axis, and you can see it march up. These slopes I'm going to show you are based on your actual cost of replying to a voluntary termination. What does it cost me to replace somebody? Because that's where it shows up in dollars and cents. You can say, Joe just quit, or Kim just quit. I'm really going to miss them, but I guess it was, they got this issue with their kid, or or whomever else. This doesn't distinguish between caregiving that's for kids and caregiving that's for adults. If it costs me 33% to replace that person, that determines the slope of the line. So you can see once you get to reducing turnover 3%, you're considerably in the money. And if you get to 5%, with a 33% cost of a year's salary to replace that person, you're generating more than 100% ROI. Now, why did I pick 33%? That is pretty much the lowest cost to somebody to replace a worker. That is a standard outcome of tons of research. But look at what happens when the 33% starts to increase. Boom, boom, boom. Now remember, the highest turnover is your highest paid workers. In all the research that's been done by the compensation consultants, by my research team, by other people at other universities, when you get to a white collar worker, you're talking much closer to 100 to 150% of total annual comp to replace that person in terms of headhunter fees, time that the job is unfilled, things like that. And when you talk about really high level white collar, you're talking about still more. And this is the ROI, not for just I get that worker. This is the ROI for having bought the benefit for the entire workforce. So imagine I'm reducing my turnover by different rates up and down that x-axis for different grades of workers. The lower wage workers, where it costs me 33% to replace them, those VPs at 100%, and those above VPs at above 150%. Some mix of those every year leave. And if I blending across all of the sensitivity analysis, these scenarios, I get to some aggregate number. But the reason I wanted to show it to you this way, and I'll show you an equivalent analysis for productivity in a moment, is that the numbers don't have to be big. Now, sure, if you have a retail chain and you're driving 70% annual turnover, if you can reduce that turnover by 6 or 7% and rack up those 33% per capita savings, or at least defer it for a year, you're way in the money. But if Wealthy has about 100 large clients, when you get to companies with highly desired, super skilled, social skills, high technological skills, the whole package, a 30-something that's a high riser, I only have to save 2 or 3 of those if I'm a Cisco or a Boeing or a Fidelity in order to cover the whole workforce with a positive ROI. Now let's look at it from a productivity point of view. In this instance, final important point is that for the workers covered who use the benefit Wealthy since the company installed it, 30% of them 29.7% of them said the availability of wealthy caused them not to quit or ask for a leave. So it blows away all these numbers. Same thing in productivity, same march, but this is the slope is determined by how many hours per quarter for what percentage of workers. So the vertical axis continues to be ROI, and you'll notice that it's much more compressed than the previous because the costs of the productivity loss are much less than someone quitting. But if I can reduce a percentage of absenteeism on the on the x-axis by 2.5 hours or per quarter, I'm not making it, I got a negative return. But what if it goes to 12.5 hours per quarter? Less than 2 full days. If that's affecting, if I can save 50% of the workforce from spending 1 3/4 days out because of the absence of a caregiving service, let's say emergency care coverage, if I wake up in the morning, my kid's got strep, I'm in the money. Well, what if it's 22.25 hours per quarter? Let's remember that. So now we're talking about 3 days of work of absenteeism avoided. And remember, disproportionately, these events fall in those 26 to 40-year-old female categories as it relates to childcare. Once again, it's one of the best investments you'd have in your entire portfolio. In fact, for the wealthy service population, the average reported absences was 68.9. So more than a week of work for a caregiving. Now remember, this is someone who's using the benefits, so they have a caregiving need, but off the charts on the x-axis. So, overall for the roughly 100 companies in the wealthy sample, the ROI on buying this type of benefit was 360%. In addition to that, there's a softer benefits that I didn't try to qualify through this research, but I think you'll admit have some value. In addition to have improved retention and productivity, employees, as you can see on the right-hand side, reported higher morale and engagement. And 2/3 of workers reported improved productivity. And I want to make one thing clear. I'm not an investor in wealthy. I'm not compensated by wealthy. I'm not on the board of wealthy. I have no economic relationship with wealthy. I picked wealthy because they had a very well-defined service offer. And I knew the management team. The graduate is the founder's a graduate of our school. And we're having a lot of success in the market with big companies, and big companies, do the math. So I wanted to reverse engineer the math they did to demonstrate to you that these aren't feel-good decisions. These are hard-nosed ROI decisions to keep more of your workers in place at the critical stage of their career. And it's particularly important to do it now on childcare, because childcare is still heavily done by women in the United States who are getting the degrees and have the soft skills you need for competitive success. So your supply of talent is going to be increasingly female, the hardest talent to get. Retaining them once you've got them is going to be an urgent priority, and they largely leave, especially the more they're paid, because they've got caregiving, which is disproportionately related to kids. So what are some basic takeaways? And I'll come back to Kim to see if you have any questions or comments. First of all, you have to understand that caregiving has systems-wide effect. It is not a simple, they have to take a day off because their, kid is having health difficulties or is having trouble in school. It permeates your economics. Get more information about your workforce's care demographics. Less than half of US companies say they can actually say how many parents with special needs kids do we have? How many couples do we have, or individuals do we have that are simultaneously got kids they're caring for at home and parents or other seniors they're caring for at home? revisit job descriptions, career paths, and managerial incentives. This is going to be particularly important, irrespective of whether you find my argument about caregiving compelling, because the job descriptions in most companies are direct descendants from job descriptions written in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, certainly large companies. And the job things you get through sources like consulting firms and they all share the same DNA, which they got created, as did career paths, around the logic of the traditional household that we think of as two adults in a heterosexual committed relationship where the male is disproportionately likely to be the bread earner working outside the home, and the woman does 100% of the work inside the home, and only rarely is choosing to work outside the home. That paradigm went out in the 80s and 90s. Look at that slope of the growth of women's workforce participation. But career paths have not really kept up. So people have added things, we'll have mentoring programs to try to help people overcome the fact that, to get from manager to district manager, you have to be willing to travel 4 days a week in a car. Well, gosh, you just excluded a large percent of your growing percentage of people you want that job will have these social skills and technical skills, because that doesn't fit with their lives. Or they have a good account, you want them to become a district sales manager, but they decline the promotion because they know what that job takes. And what that job takes is dictated by your managerial incentives and your career paths. Always figure out why people are leaving your organization, if at all possible, at all levels. The truth will set you free on this. If you start finding out you're losing people because of anything from commute time to lack of caregiving benefits, you can make systemic benefits-based responses to that. And if you find out that people are leaving one facility or another because they all think they've got a lousy supervisor, then you've got data about an intervention on career development for that supervisor or the need to make a change. Let caregiving be openly discussed in the organization to save you from getting surprised. And from all of you out there, this has to start at the top. If a senior executive or very respected long-term employee is prepared to be candid with others about how caregiving was challenged for them, how they responded to it, in what ways, how they're using the services they're involved, what ideas they can get from the workforce as well as give to the workforce, then all of a sudden you make it discussable, and that saves you lots of ugly surprises down the road where somebody who's been intimidated to bring up a challenge they've got chooses to quit rather than engage you in a open conversation about how can you help me accommodate this temporary or long-term situation I'm now confronting. And then with the caregiving services you've got, audit them, get feedback from employees, and particularly those who do use them. And you don't have to launch something like a Wealthy or something from a care.com or Bright Horizons or other people who are in this space on a nationwide, all workforce basis. Run some experiments, announce them as an experiment. If you've got, multiple geographies, regions in your business, launch it in one as an experiment and contrast the results there and things that turnover productivity with another, what we call an A/B experiment. So I'm very, very grateful for your attendance and attention. Grateful for Kim and the board for inviting me to do this. And Kim, let me stop sharing. And if you have a couple of questions that we could deal with in our last few minutes together, I'm happy to try to answer them.
Hey, well, thank you very much. It was extremely interesting and informative. When we started off, the chat wasn't working. It should be working now, or you could put questions into the Q&A. So I have a couple questions while we see if people have other questions. I really love that you talked about the culture and changing to a caregiving culture. But do you have any maybe recommendations or advice for a company that just does not have that type of culture, that's wanting to kind of shift their culture over?
Wanting to try to take their culture in that direction?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think, we think of companies working on policy and procedure and implementation. That's just not my experience of companies, particularly when it comes to culture. They travel on stories.
Mhm.
So the first thing I'd start doing is make this discussable. And I'd look particularly for examples of workers that either have overcome caregiving challenges or the company has overcome giving challenges. One thing I'll say for a lot of smaller and medium-sized companies, there are lots of stories about employers who they knew their employee base well enough to know that, Kim had a challenge that was, that completely unexpected with her son or her daughter. Joe had a challenge with his son or her daughter, and they took customized unilateral actions to help. Employees who will never have that challenge will be hugely motivated by hearing that story because the company cared about Kim or Joe as an individual. Kids, younger workers who are facing those dilemmas are much more likely to raise them. And it's okay for the company to say we can't go beyond certain things. We can't afford, we'd love to make you a regional sales manager, but we can't hire someone to travel you on the road to babysit your newborn. That doesn't work for us, but we can try to, make sure you never have to travel on less than 1 week's notice. We can give you emergency childcare benefit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But first thing is to make people know, I don't like familial analogies in companies, saying a company is like a family, but the company cares about its workers being productive, engaged, and focused on their work. And yes, we have human sentiments too, but it's just a clear, rational business decision. By the way, the non-caregivers need to hear that, so they're not saying, well, what about me? I'm not benefiting from that. They should, I'm owed something, which is kind of a bizarre thing we're hearing more of in the workplace.
Well, great. Thank you so much. We appreciate you taking time to join in us today. Patty, if you wouldn't mind putting up our closing slides, that would be great. Perfect. So our next webinar in this series will be July 24th, and we'll be featuring Evelyn Knight. We will be discussing the broken business model of modern childcare. And the link to register is on the screen. If you haven't registered yet, please take a moment to complete the registration for the July 24th webinar. And if you can go to the next slide, Patty. If your business is interested in examining supports for your workforce, the Children's Cabinet offers a free consultation service. You can visit the QR code to sign up for more information. There's also one-pagers on different solutions in our website, and that website is already in the chat. You could also, if you are interested, take the 3-minute self-assessment to see if you qualify as a best place for working parents business. So as we end, a poll should pop up, and we would really appreciate it if you take our poll. I'd like to thank everyone for your time and look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.